Magnolia blossoms carry a sweetness that lies. They float on the air like a church solo, and you forget how hard the roots had to push through clay to bloom like that. 30 years ago, under that same sweet perfume and the soft clatter of plates at Magnolia Grill, Ronald asked me to marry him. His hand shook so hard the ring box nearly bounced into the étouffée. I said yes with my whole chest, because back then his laugh was sunlight and his promises felt like railings I could lean on. Tonight, through the restaurant's big glass pane that turns Peachtree Street into a stage, I watch those same hands cradle a girl child's wrist. Honey-blond hair, 20s at best, nails like thumbnails of the moon. He leaned close, voice pitched in that tender register I once thought was only mine. "You're special," he told her. The word slipped into me like a splinter. Small, mean, impossible to ignore. I should have stormed in. My daughter, Patrice, has my temper. She would have set the linen napkins alight with a look. But 62 gives you a different kind of power. You learn how to let the moment breathe until it shows you its weak point. I stood under the magnolia. Rain spit starting up and kept watching. The girl rubbed the inside of his wrist with her thumb like she was polishing a coin. When she asked about his wife, I saw her mouth form the word. He laughed it off with a flick of his hand I knew too well. "She's busy with her flowers and her shows," he said. "At our age?" Our age. He said it like a dusty shelf he meant to wipe when he got around to it. The waiter brought beignets, sugar smoke rising like prayer. A car horn protested the red light. Somewhere a bus sighed. And I stood in the city that birthed my parents and their vows, feeling my marriage shrink to a shrug in a man's mouth. I walked home under a sky the color of dishwater, shoes ticking against the sidewalk, my breath steady. The house smelled like hibiscus and lemon oil. My cuttings lined the window like a chorus. I boiled water because that's what a southern woman does when the world tilts. You put the kettle on. While it fussed, my eye fell on the blue accordion folder Ronald had asked me to sign through, 6 months back. Just a few formalities, baby. Easier for tax season. You know I hate paperwork. Inside that tidy spine lived our lives. Title to the Midtown condo, the warranty deed to the little lake cottage he called our retreat, and a web of LLC interests. Dealerships, restaurant shares, a storage facility in College Park. Every signature line neatly filled with my name. Safer to keep assets under one roof, he'd said, meaning mine. Audit proof. I had signed because love and habit and a long marriage taught me the rhythm of his requests. He handled the money beat, I kept time on everything else. But age will make a scientist out of you. You test premises. I lined up the pages like specimens on the kitchen island. One by one I read what I had slept through. Sole member, sole owner, sole signatory. A laugh lifted out of me. Short, not mean. More like a bark from an old hound who's just put the scent together. He had spent years tucking assets under my name to hide from scrutiny and had forgotten that names carry rights. The kettle clicked. I poured honey into my cup with care and let the tea steep until the steam fogged the stovetop clock. Somewhere in the city, a siren stitched the night together and then let go. I could have cried then. 30 years of casseroles and car notes. 3 children raised to be weatherproof. Holidays spun out of pennies and patience. All of it flattened to a shrug at table 11. But tears felt like a luxury I'd buy later if I still wanted them. What came instead was a clean, bright stillness. The kind of cold focus that settled over me the day Patrice went missing for 40 minutes at Lenox when she was 7. You set your heartbeat on a shelf and make a plan. I wrote it out on the back of an old grocery list because I'm a woman who likes a sequence. Day 1, call Linda Watson. You don't pick a lawyer for her hostility, you pick her for her accuracy. Linda cut her teeth on messy divorces and municipal boondoggles, and I'd once watched her tenderize a witness with nothing but a spreadsheet and a smile. Day 2, lock the banks. Not because I feared scarcity. Ronald and I built enough for 2 generations to breathe easy, but because doors left ajar invite raccoons. Day 3, restructure. Sell what I don't want to maintain, convert shares to liquidity with safeguards that no man with a knot in his tie can unravel. Day 4, secure the roof. The house, the cottage, the storage unit that probably hides more than boats and Christmas decorations, everything changed to keys only I carry. Day 5, look him in the eye and say the words that deserve the echo of a good room. I slept lightly and woke at 5 before the birds gave the dawn permission. Linda answered on the second ring, voice ragged with sleep and curiosity. I laid it out. Magnolia Grill, the girl, the folder, my name. She hummed the way a surgeon hums when the scalpel's already in her hand. You're sole owner? She asked. Everywhere it matters, I said. Then, we start with the power of attorney you gave him for convenience, she replied. We revoke it by noon. I heard keys tapping. And Sharon? We move quick. Surprise is a kind of evidence. By breakfast, a mobile notary had stamped 3 envelopes in my dining room. By lunch, my bank app was a flock of sparrows, accounts opened, permissions narrowed, wires rerouted, text alerts primed to sing if a mouse twitched. I dressed for errands in navy slacks and a blouse Patrice calls my boardroom armor, though I still stop to deadhead the hibiscus because there's work, and then there's the work that makes a woman herself. At the dealership, I shook hands with a man who used to flirt with me in the parking lot when I came for oil changes. He didn't flirt now. When you sit across from a woman whose name is on the paper, your jokes dry up. We discussed the sale of my minority stake with timing that benefited me and story that did not. At the restaurant group's office, I signed a right of first refusal letter that caused a small, respectful storm. By sunset, I held commitments enough to cushion a war chest and lighten my load. It should have hurt more. That surprised me. You think you'll break in pieces over the actions of the person who promised to stash your minutes in his pocket for safekeeping. Instead, I found my pieces right where I'd left them, waiting to be used. I ate soup, standing at the sink like a student, and turned on the small TV I keep for weather and the occasional cooking show. A rerun of some glossy drama flickered through a divorce scene that felt like theater compared with the quiet accounting of a real day like mine. Ronald texted as the credits rolled, "Dinner Friday? Magnolia?" The audacity landed like a paper airplane on the table. I smoothed its crease and typed back, "Friday works." 7 p.m. He sent a heart, as if we were teenagers, and I watched it arrive and then vanish, when my thumb held the message for 2 seconds longer than sentiment. By the time the house settled and the streetlight painted a pale square on my living room rug, I had my folder in my bag, my mind set like a nail-driven true. I stood at the bedroom mirror and saw what the years had done to my face, softened it here, sharpened it there, and what they had not undone. The straightness of my spine, the way my chin knows where it belongs. 5 days, I told the woman in the glass. Not because you're vengeful, because you're finished being invisible in your own story. If you're the praying kind, you might think I asked for strength then. I didn't. I asked for precision. Strength gets you through a storm. Precision builds a better roof after. Friday would come with its napkins and its lies and its dessert menus. Between now and then, I would make sure every bolt in my house knew who turned it tight. Day 2 arrived like a list I couldn't wait to check off. I woke before the sun got its breath together, slid a navy blazer over a t-shirt, and tucked the blue accordion folder into a leather tote I hadn't used since Patrice's law school graduation. There is a posture you put on when you intend to be taken seriously. Chin leveled, shoulders square, polite smile like a seatbelt. I wore it to the first bank and kept it on through 3 more. At Peachtree Community, Ms. Eubanks in the private client office remembered Ronald's birthday and my hibiscus. She did not expect my new vocabulary. "We'll be revoking all third-party access today," I said, voice velvet over steel. "Power of attorney already rescinded. Any auto transfers tied to a household card, you'll route them to this account instead." I slid paper across the desk, watched her scan the notary seals, saw the moment she adjusted her idea of me as the woman who brings macaroons at Christmas. In an hour, text alerts chimed. Permissions revoked, pins reset, wires settled like geese on a lake. At the next bank, the process went faster. By lunch, the financial river had learned a new course, its old channels dry. I treated myself to a bowl of broth and a good chair at a corner noodle shop. My phone face down on the table like a dog trained to stay. An older couple folded dumplings together behind the counter, hands moving in mirror. I felt something warm slip under my ribs, not happiness exactly, but the relief of work behaving like it should when you measure twice and cut true. Day 3 belonged to the ledger's heavy blocks, equity nobody sees until it shifts. Linda sent a spreadsheet at dawn with 3 columns. Keep, convert, let go. I walked into the dealership conference room, shook hands with a partner who had once joked that my best asset was my smile. "Turns out it's my signature," I said, and his laugh came out clipped as a receipt. We agreed on a buyback at a number that cushioned, not bled. At the storage facility office, I signed a service contract that turned my minority interest into quarterly payments, set to outlast any tantrum. The restaurant group was sticky. Their CFO phrased questions like traps, but Linda had trained me well. "I prefer dividends to drama," I said, and watched him calculate how much of each I had authority to create. By late afternoon, my folder had gained new documents: sale agreements, escrow confirmations, notarized letters that spelled out who would not be entering my life uninvited again. I texted Patrice and my boys, Lionel and Drew, a simple "I'm fine." "Handling something. Love you," Patrice replied, with a red heart and a knife emoji because my child is both dramatic and well-read. The boys sent thumbs up and a gif of Denzel nodding. I did not share details. Children deserve a mother, not a live feed. On the way home, I stopped at our storage unit, the one Ronald always joked was Noah's Ark for holiday excess. My key turned without drama. The roll-up door complained, then yielded. Inside, the usual. Easter bins, the artificial tree that sheds like a jealous cat, a canoe we used twice and lied to ourselves about thrice. I ran fingertips over the crate labeled Old Tax R. The corner had been cut and taped back. Inside, we had filed like saints. Recently, someone had rummaged like a sinner. I took photos in case tomorrow required them. That evening, I let the television talk to itself while I moved through the house, deleting traces. His laptop's saved passwords, the old emergency contact card in my wallet that named him first. I updated the alarm code to something only my fingers knew, not the date we met or our anniversary, which nostalgia will try to make you type. I brewed chamomile and sat at the kitchen island beneath the soft hum of not yet grief. 40 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I didn't know he was married, I'm sorry. No name, only the apology of someone who's just realized she's been holding a match too close to parchment. I typed and erased 3 drafts before settling on the only sentence I could manage without lying to either of us. Thank you for telling me that. Take care of yourself. Day 4 was logistics wrapped in law. Linda met me at a Cobb County notary's office with a stack that looked like a choir. Petition for divorce. Motion for exclusive use of the residence. Notice to vacate served with all the ceremony Georgia requires when a man forgets he is a guest. 7 days is generous, Linda said, sliding the papers into a crisp envelope. We can do 72 hours if you'd rather. I thought of a woman, myself, packing 30 years into boxes between phone calls and casseroles. Mercy is a habit I don't intend to quit, even when I change everything else. 7, I said. Plenty of time to practice leaving. From there, we drove to the county clerk to file, the courthouse smell of dust and disinfectant settling into my hair like a mood. The clerk stamped the timestamp with the calm of a priest. On the steps, Linda squeezed my hand. Friday you deliver the news, she said. It won't be the first time a magnolia has been fertilized with regret. On the way home, I swung into the pedal shed, the little shop where I buy cuttings and apologies. Miss Relly at the counter raised an eyebrow at my navy blazer, a uniform she'd learned meant business. You want lilies or something that lives? She asked. Roses, I said, bare root, the stubborn kind. She wrapped them in paper thick as Saturday comics. Plant them deep, she advised, and don't rush the bloom just because you're ready to see it. That night, I set the dining room for a war council of one. Folder, legal pad, pen that writes like it has a grudge. I rehearsed my lines like an actress who refuses to go up on her cue. Ronald, we are done. These are the terms. This is the timeline. This is my seat at the head of my own table. My phone lit again. Lionel FaceTiming from his messy apartment, hair uncombed, love honest. You good, Ma? He asked. I'm good, I said. He glanced off screen and whispered, Patrice thinks you're about to do something cinematic. I laughed, throat stinging. Tell your sister real life is quieter than the movies, but it lasts longer. I slept with the folder beside the bed like a psalm. At 3 a.m., I woke, heart steady, and walked the house barefoot. Living room, hallway, the den. Ronald insists on calling the media room as if a fancier name made a cheaper couch feel like leather. I place my palm on the door to the guest room where he's been sleeping to give us space. The handle was cool. I didn't open it. Dawn smudged the blinds with peach. I dressed deliberate, black dress, pearl studs, flats that could sprint if rage required. The folder slid into my tote. Lipstick leaned into the line of my mouth like a period at the end of a sentence finally finished. On the porch, the city's first streetcar rattled past, and the magnolia across the way released one more early bloom, stubborn and showy. I locked the door behind me and headed for Peachtree for linen napkins and heavy silver and the man who believed he could hand me a roll and watch me play it forever. All day I moved like a clock, noon with Linda for a final check, 2 o'clock with Miss Relly to schedule a gardener for the backyard the day after I changed the locks, 4 to photocopy an extra set of documents, because experience teaches you the copier is the first machine God breaks on a crucial day. At 6:52, I stood outside Magnolia Grill in a rain that forgot how to commit, misting the sidewalk and shining the leaves. I could see our table through the glass, corner banquette where he proposed, where we celebrated promotions and survived layoffs, where we taught our children how to use a soup spoon and a complicated word in the same night. Ronald arrived at 6:58, tie perfect, hairline lined sharper than truth. He saw me and smiled like we were still made of soft afternoons. He didn't know the storm was already over. All that remained was the architecture of what would stand. Magnolia Grill smells the same as it did the night he asked for forever. Butter and garlic and the faint tobacco of a maitre d's cologne that never quite leaves the velvet curtains. The hostess clocked us with that trained brightness that makes strangers feel expected. Ronald slid into the corner banquette like a man stepping back into a favorite pair of shoes. He reached for my hand across the linen as if there weren't a river between us. I let him take the air, and not the skin. "You look beautiful, Sharon," he said, voice dipped in the old honey. "I've been thinking maybe we took space a little too seriously. Let's reset. Weekend at the lake? I'll cook. I'll make what's that pasta you like?" "Cacio e pepe," I offered. Simple, honest. He laughed, relieved. A waiter appeared, poured water that caught the chandelier light like small stars, set down menus we did not need. "I didn't come to reset," I said, opening my tote. "I came to make the record true." His smile thinned, then learned to behave. "Sharon, if this is about that misunderstanding, don't insult me with euphemisms in a room that taught us how to tell the truth," I said, laying the first document on the table. Revocation of power of attorney, notarized, time-stamped. The second, petition for divorce. The third, notice to vacate the marital residence within 7 days. Keys to be turned over to me or my agent. Then came the bank letters. Account access narrowed like a funnel to a single point with my name on it. Finally, copies of the buyback and conversion agreements. Paper stacked between us like a low, precise wall. Ronald stared at the pile the way a man looks at water rising under a door. You sold the dealership stake without telling me?" The bravado arrived late and loud. "You can't just... Sharon, this is madness. Those were strategic positions." "Those were ballast on a ship I no longer sail with you," I said. "You parked half your empire in my name and called it a convenience. I've simply brought my property home." He leaned back, scouring the room for an ally and finding only paintings of floral still lifes too polite to help. "You can't evict me from my own house. It isn't your house." I slid the deed forward with the grace of a communion plate. "You knew that when you asked me to sign. You counted on me never reading closely enough to use what you hid." The waiter hovered. "Shall I give you a moment?" And I nodded. Ronald's jaw worked. He tried on rage and found it ill-fitting in a restaurant he loved more for its reflections than its food. "You're embarrassed," he said finally, softer, a different weapon. "That's what this is. You saw something that upsets you, and now you're doing the most." "I saw a pattern I've been ignoring," I answered, and then I did exactly enough. He reached for that tone that had sold 100 cars and charmed 1,000 strangers. "Sharon, think about the children. Patrice will make this into a spectacle. Drew and Lionel, holidays will be a battlefield. And look, we've built a life. Surely we can agree on a path that preserves dignity." "Dignity is a solo sport," I said, "and the children are grown men and a woman with spines I paid for in sleep. They can handle a mother who finally picked up her own." A figure slipped past the host stand, all twilight hair and high heels, the kind of entrance that flutters napkins. She stopped when our table came into focus, the shared husband, the documents, and turned on a dime, shoulders tightening under a jacket she'd worn to feel older than she is. Her reflection caught mine in the window glass. Not enemies, just two women orbiting a man who mistook attention for gravity. Ronald followed my glance, color rising. You invited... I invited no one, I said, but truth likes a crowd. He put both hands flat on the table, went for the last rope available, threat. I have lawyers. So do I said, smiling for the first time. And unlike yours, mine doesn't have to spend the first hour untangling the web you spun to hide assets from auditors. God, Sharon, he hissed, voice fraying, you'd throw away 30 years over a mistake. I'm not throwing anything away, I said. I'm salvaging. There's a difference. Silence spread, generous and terrible. The waiter reappeared with plates we hadn't ordered. Chef's compliments, he said brightly, setting down a small tower of crab and something citrus that smelled like a memory. Ronald stared at his food like it might deliver him from paperwork. I opened my water and let the cold wash the last of the tremor from my throat. 7 days, I repeated, sliding the vacate notice closer. If you leave the house like a gentleman, I'll instruct Linda to keep this civil and contained. You'll have what the law says you should. If you test me, you will meet the parts of the law you have never bothered to learn. He laughed then, a brittle sound that belonged to a younger, poorer man who hated being reminded of rules. You think you can contain this? Sharon, my mother, my partners, the church. What happens when people hear? People always hear, I said. Let them hear the true thing, not the pretty half of it. He slumped a fraction, a man acclimating to thinner air. And the cottage? He asked, almost pleading. The lake. That's ours. It was. I slid the photo I'd tucked behind the contracts. Us, 27 and 32, sunburned and drunk on having survived another year, holding up a pair of ugly fish-like trophies. I let him look. I'll keep it because I remember that woman, I said, not because of the man in the frame. He touched the photo without taking it, the way you handle a relic that might shatter. You're going to be alone, he said, not cruel, just unimaginative. I've been alone sitting across from you for years, I said. This will be the honest version. We ate, or I did. He pushed food like paperwork around a desk. When the check came, I placed my card down on top of the divorce petition as if to say I cover my own endings. He didn't fight me for the bill. Some lines even he wouldn't cross under a chandelier. On the sidewalk, Magnolia's neon buzzed a faint blue halo over his face. The city breathed around us, sirens far away, laughter closer by, the magnolia tree shedding one late bloom like punctuation. He reached for my elbow, not to stop me but to steady himself. What do I tell my mother? He asked of all the questions. Tell her I wished her boy had told the truth sooner, I said. Tell her it might have saved him some money. Tell her I'm planting roses. I walked away then, not in triumph, but in completion. The air felt wider than it had in months. At the corner, my phone hummed. Linda. All filed. Process server confirms delivery at noon. Sleep. I texted back a single rose emoji because sometimes emojis do the job of entire paragraphs. At home, I hung my blazer on the back of the chair and felt the weight come off. Not just fabric, but duty I had dragged well past its warranty. In the bedroom, the folder went into the bottom drawer under my slip dresses as if softness might cushion law. On my pillow lay no apology, no note. I didn't expect one. Sometime around 2, when the house has its private noises, I woke to headlights sliding across the ceiling. A car idled outside long enough to make a point, then moved on. I pictured Ronald at the wheel, practicing a speech he would never deliver well. I pictured the girl in a rideshare staring out at her reflection in a stranger's window. I pictured myself at the kitchen sink tomorrow morning, hands in cool water, roots of bare roses soaking before first light, the images stacked in my mind like the documents had on the linen. Orderly, final, clean. I slept again, and for once the dream did not replay the restaurant. It showed me a backyard in June, sun tattooing my shoulders while blossoms unwound themselves without asking permission. And because even victory needs a next page, I woke with a question lodged under my ribs like the good kind of ache. After 7 days, when the locks turn and the house relearns my footsteps, what will I do with all that free air? 7 days is a long time when you finally measure it in your own breath. Day 1 began with a knock that didn't belong to any neighbor's rhythm. I opened the door on the safety chain to find Mother Miller on my porch. Hat with a silk hydrangea, pearls tight as a conscience. She didn't bother with hello. "You can't do this to my son," she announced, gloved hand already pushing the door as if her fingers still outranked hinges. "Marriage is work. You don't burn a house because a window sticks." "You're right," I said, keeping the chain snug. "You fix the window. You don't bring tinder." She started in on scripture, submission and long-suffering pronounced like vitamins I'd forgotten to take, then shifted to public opinion, which in Atlanta can feel more binding than law. "People talk, Sharon. Church talks. You want that hung on you?" I let her talk until words wore themselves thin. Then I named the facts that outlive gossip: the deed, the revocation, the 7 days. "We both know you taught your boy to enter rooms like they're owed," I added, soft as I could make it. "I'm teaching him what a door is for." Her mouth trembled into something less righteous and more human. For a heartbeat, I almost unlatched, invited her in to sit, to sip, to consider where all our mothers go wrong trying to love sons into men. But mercy can also be a boundary. "Please don't come back without calling," I said. "I won't open next time." She turned on her low heel and left magnolia scent behind, a perfume that always pretends it never hurt anyone. Day 2. The process server texted a picture of Ronald taking the envelope like an appetizer he hadn't ordered. Day 3, Patrice came by with a pie and a lecture I didn't require. "Mama, I am proud of you, but also ready if he tries anything stupid." She patted the tote where she keeps pepper spray and 2 different chargers, as if betrayal can be stunned by voltage. We repotted a fern anyway, because a woman can hold fury in one hand and soil in the other. On day 4, the girl came. No eyeliner, hair scraped back like apology, a denim jacket too thin for the breeze. She stood on the porch, shifting weight as if my welcome might change with the angle of her ankle. "Ms. Miller?" she asked. When I nodded, she breathed out like a tire giving up air. "I didn't know he was married the first time," she said. "I did the second, and that shame's mine." Her voice had the small rasp of someone who learned grown up too fast. She told me he'd promised clean endings and said my name like weather. Inevitable, distant. He says he's going to freeze the accounts back and challenge those sales. She grimaced. He used phrases I didn't understand, but he sounded like a man who thinks rules are furniture. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Do you need a glass of water?" She shook her head, her eyes snagged on my rose canes soaking in the sink through the front windows. "My grandma grew those," she offered, a scrap of lineage laid down between strangers. I stepped off the porch, put my palm lightly on her shoulder, a blessing that wasn't a pardon. "When a man asks you to lie to yourself to love him, he's practicing," I said. "Practice leaving faster next time." She nodded, a single hard dip, and left with her jacket hugged tight. I watched her pass my magnolia and prayed the tree would keep its mouth shut. That night, a text from a number I knew too well. "You're being cruel." I didn't answer. Cruelty is tearing out the plumbing and pretending the flood was an act of God. Boundaries are sandbags. Day 5, Ronald called my mother. Her "now why he go and call me" came through my phone like a tambourine. "I told him you were born stubborn and raised excellent," she said, "and that I taught you to pack a bag, not your pride." We laughed until it shook loose a little grief. After, I moved through closets, gathering his loose life, ties with wine stains, cufflinks that never held, the t-shirt from a beach where we promised to be our best selves. I folded each with more respect than it had shown me. Day 6, the locksmith arrived. He was 23 with a barbershop fade and a niece in my neighborhood. "My aunties say you always tip in cash." He grinned, then grew solemn when I explained why the deadbolts had to forget. He oiled the hinges, rekeyed the cylinders, tested the new code twice. "You want the keypad to be your birthday?" he offered. "Something you won't forget." I picked numbers that belonged to only me, not a wedding, not a child, not a house closing. When the latch clicked under my fingers, something inside me did too, like a rib-making room. At dusk I found the note, on my pillow, writing that leaned left the way his temper does. "You'll regret this." No signature, as if cowards need anonymity to feel tall. I held the paper until it felt warm, then tore it once, twice, again, confetti of a man's small bravado drifting into the trash. Regret is a guest you let in when you've lied to yourself. I'd told the truth all week. I slept sound. Day 7 tasted like metal and mint. I brewed coffee for the first time in weeks just because the smell makes a house remember it's a home. The roses went into soil at 7 a.m. Relly's stubborn kind, bare root, thorned like a sermon. I set each cane upright, filled the hole, tamped the earth with the heel of my palm. When I stood, dirt lined my nails like proof. The locksmith's work sang under my key, new bolts sliding into a new answer. By noon, Ronald's SUV idled at the curb, Mother Miller's sedan tucked behind. A cousin I hadn't seen since a funeral idling after that. He came up the walk slower than swagger allows, eyes cutting sideways at my hydrangeas like they might testify. "This is foolishness," he said by way of greeting. "Your things are in the garage," I replied. "On the left, I'll have the gardener put them in the truck." He stared over my shoulder into a house that no longer leaned toward him. "You won't even let me say goodbye in there?" I could have told him we'd been saying goodbye in there for years. At Thanksgiving, when he chose football noise over conversation on a Tuesday, he forgot to ask about my mother's checkup in bed miles apart. Instead, I held the door frame because it held me. 7 days, I said. This is the last hour of the last one. He tried 3 more keys and 3 more arguments. Mother Miller tried prayer in a register too close to accusation. I let both pass like weather. When the truck door finally thudded shut on the last box, a thin rain began. Ronald stood in it, no hat, the kind of wet that makes men look like the boys who taught them how to beg and never how to apologize. "Who are you without me?" he asked, not sneering, honestly baffled. "Honestly," I said, "lighter." He left then, tires printing their own punctuation down the block. The cousin saluted me with 2 fingers, respect coded in a small shared language. Mother Miller did not look back. Inside, I wiped the floors like a ritual, opened windows to pull the weather through every room. The house exhaled. On the kitchen island, I laid out a clean towel and the tea set my daughter calls Old Lady Elegant. The kettle clicked. I tipped hot water until steam kissed my face. Before I sat, I went to the mirror, the full-length one in the bedroom that has watched me in dresses, in nightgowns, in sweat and grief. A woman looked back who belonged in her own frame, chin up, shoulders level, neck ringed by the pearl studs I'd put on the day I went to the bank. I thought of every mirror I'd avoided the last year and felt a small, potent fury at the time I'd given to shrinking. Enough, I said to her, which was to me. Phone vibrated. Linda. Keys returned. I sent a photo of bare bolts and rose canes in fresh mounds. Patrice, how you holding? I answered with a picture of the tea tray in the corner of my smile. Miss Relly remembered a water low, not over the leaves. I replied with a thank you and a promise. Evening fell the way it does here, quick, sudden blue. I sat on the back steps with my cup and listened to the city clicking into its night self. A train somewhere, a neighbor laughing, the hum of a streetlight. A breeze lifted the hem of my dress. The roses sat like small soldiers in their bed, not yet blooming but already here. I didn't think about Magnolia Grill or the girl, or the note torn to quiet. I thought about paint colors for the guest room I'd reclaimed, about the new lock code in my muscles, about calling my mother tomorrow, just to hear where she'd hide the good candy if she were me. Freedom isn't fireworks. It's a bolt sliding easy, a kettle set to sing, a garden bed laid with care. Tomorrow I'll call a contractor to refinish the floors in the room that forgot my name. Tonight, I'll sleep with windows open and let the house teach itself my breathing again. The first week alone taught the house my tempo again. Footsteps soft in the hall at sunrise, kettle clicking like a metronome, the back door sighing open just enough to let hibiscus gossip with the breeze. Freedom made noise I hadn't heard in years. Drawers sliding without catching on somebody else's socks. My name in my own mouth without a question mark. Of course, the world doesn't turn quiet just because you do. By Wednesday, the church prayer chain had braided itself into a rumor rope strong enough to tow a truck. Mother Miller took her grievances to anyone who'd pretend to be neutral, and Ronald tried a full-court charm on our mutuals, a misunderstanding, a trial separation, Sharon's nerves. I let the phone ring until it learned my new policy. Leave a message or leave me be. When I did answer, I used a sentence I'd practiced like scales. This is a private legal matter. I'm safe. I appreciate your care. Then I went back to pruning canes and reading Heat and Leaves. Patrice wanted blood, which is to say justice but fast. She called every evening with a new plan that sounded like a closing argument, then exhaled when I reminded her that Linda files paperwork like a musician reads timing. Exact, unhurried, devastating. Lionel texted recipes and memes because that's the language he knows how to send love in. Drew, my quiet storm, came by with a toolbox and tightened cabinet hinges I didn't realize were loose. Nobody asked how I slept. They learned to watch the way I buttered toast. Steady meant fine. Torn meant prayer. On Monday, Linda and I video met in our respective blazers like a two-woman board meeting. She shared her screen and walked me through the next fortifications. Temporary orders for exclusive possession of the home, an accounting of marital assets, a freeze on any transfers Ronald might try with his golf buddies at the bank. He's going to posture, she warned, because some men only recognize reality when a judge hands it to them in a sentence. She smiled the small lawyer smile that lives somewhere between mercy and precision. Let him posture. We'll paper over it. By afternoon, the court had stamped a restraining order on the accounts and set a hearing for early next month. Ronald's attorney, one I knew by his glossy billboard near I-85, emailed a letter that read like a chest puff and a stall tactic knitted together. Linda forwarded it with a one-line note, empty calories. Hydrate and ignore. I did. Hydration, as it turns out, is a self-care ritual and a litigation tactic. The girl, her name is Tessa, I learned when she sent an apology typed as if she'd used both hands to push each word forward, texted again. He told me you were cold and lonely, she wrote, that you didn't want company anymore. He said men need someone to look at them like they matter. The cruelty wasn't the lie, it was how ordinary it sounded. How many women have been described as weather to justify a forecast someone else wanted? I didn't answer. She deserved a future without me in it, and I deserved a present without her voice tangled in mine. Still, when I passed the Magnolia that evening, I pressed my palm to the bark and asked it to hold some of what I was carrying. Trees have been keeping our secrets longer than churches. By Thursday, I realized I had built a life sturdy enough to hold new weight. The Master Gardener course I kept meaning to sign up for? I registered, bought the manual, slid a highlighter down the page like a plow through fresh soil. Laverne from around the corner, widowed 10 years, laughs like a tambourine, talked me into starting a Saturday porch circle. Tea, pound cake, and business, which is what she calls the tender parts we only show each other after the third slice. 4 women came the first week, 7 the next, each carrying a bag of something heavy and leaving with something light, a phone number, a name for the feeling in their chest. A cutting from my roses. The Magnolia Grill sat 2 miles away, and it would be a lie to say I didn't route my errands past it like a tongue worrying a missing tooth. One afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox with the restaurant's letterhead, handwritten by the manager, a woman I'd known since she was a hostess with shoes that blistered. Ms. Miller, chef, is retiring next month. We're planning a small farewell for regulars who remember the original gumbo. No pressure, but we'd love to see you reclaim a little good here. I set the note under a fridge magnet shaped like a peach and let it live there until my heartbeat didn't spike when I read the word reclaim. Some places don't deserve exile because somebody else misused them. A week into quiet, the storm circled back, predictable as July thunder. Ronald filed a motion accusing me of strip mining the marital estate and alienating the affections of third parties, which read like a man throwing darts drunk. He added a paragraph about my fragile nerves that made Linda's eyebrows rise all the way to her hairline. I have 3 affidavits from bankers who met with you last week and described you as exact and gracious, she said, riffling papers with delight. And I have copies of his credit card slips in the amount of a watch he can no longer afford. Evidence isn't mean. It's medicine. It stings and then it heals. That night, because courage is a muscle, I drove to the big box store and bought a motion camera for the front walk. Not because I was afraid, because I was finished giving worry rent-free rooms. I mounted it myself in the gold light of early evening, wires tidy as braids, angle just so. When the app pinged later with the image of a raccoon inspecting my hydrangeas, I laughed so hard I scared it into a clumsy retreat. Let that be a parable, I thought. Stop by if you like, but understand the porch isn't yours. On Sunday, I went back to Ebenezer. I had skipped 2 weeks to avoid becoming a sermon I didn't write. It turns out church is less about being seen and more about letting your voice braid into a hymn you only remember how to sing when somebody else starts it. Mother Miller sat 3 pews ahead, hat broad as a judgment. When the call to pass the peace came, she turned far enough to see me and then looked away as if forgiveness were a trick deck. I didn't chase her gaze. I shook the hands offered to me, squeezed a deacon's thumb until his eyes softened, and let the choir carry me past pettiness into something wide. The pastor preached on the difference between long-suffering and long-staying, that holy permission to leave a room you keep getting set on fire in. I put a folded check in the plate with a note asking the benevolence committee to fund 3 light bills this month. Mercy, but with receipts. On Monday morning, I woke before my alarm to the softest sound, the first rose unfurling. It is a hush that looks like red velvet learning to breathe. I carried coffee to the garden bed and watched the bloom make its slow argument for every choice I'd made. There is a theology in petals if you take the time. They open because they must, not because someone claps. I had meant to spend the day on budgets, but instead I drove to a nursery in Decatur and bought more roses than one woman should be left alone with. In the checkout line, an older gentleman tipped his hat and said, "Someone's starting a church." I grinned. Close. A sanctuary. Back home, I called Laverne to recruit labor. "Girl, if you get me out of this house, I will confess things," she said, arriving with gloves and gossip I pretended not to want. We planted until the sun slid low and we could see our breath in the pink of it. When my phone buzzed near dusk, I expected another volley from the billboard lawyer. Instead, it was Tessa, a final message, short and clean. I blocked him. "I'm leaving Atlanta for a while. Thank you for not hating me out loud." I typed back the only benediction I had authority to offer. Go in peace. Grow in courage. Then I set the phone face down, wiped dirt from my knees, and walked the fence line, testing each picket like a chord. The house hummed along. Later, in the quiet, bruised blue before full dark, I spread Linda's latest filings across the kitchen island and realized I wasn't reading strategy anymore. I was scanning a map of a country I'd already crossed into. There would be hearings and depositions, and a day when a judge called my name and I said present with a steadier voice than the last time I stood under oath. But the big choice had been made on a sidewalk under a neon magnolia when I slid a folder across linen and chose accuracy over habit. I washed my hands, poured tea, and sat on the back steps to listen for crickets. The roses held their breath against the cooling air. Somewhere down the block, a child practiced trumpet and got half a scale right. It sounded like a beginning, which is another kind of victory. I raised my cup to the small musician and to the woman holding her own porch, and I thought, I don't need fireworks. I have a garden that refuses to apologize for blooming. The envelope from the court arrived with the same bland authority as a water bill. White, windowed, no hints of the thunder inside. Linda called before I finished reading. Temporary orders hearing locked for the 15th at 9 a.m. Judge Albright, she said, tapping keys I could almost hear. He's fair, impatient with foolishness, and allergic to men who think charm is evidence. I poured coffee like steadiness and marked the date on the calendar with a line so straight even my high school drafting teacher would have nodded. The week before the hearing moved like honey. Slow, sticky, touched by light. In the mornings, I studied my Master Gardener binder, highlighting pages about soil amendments as if my yard were a pop quiz. Afternoons, I ran errands, the kind of mundane sovereignty that tastes better than cake. In between, bills arrived, the mapping of a new life. Only my name, only my signature, only my numbers. A relief I didn't know my body had been waiting for loosened my shoulders by degrees. Then came an invitation folded in Magnolia Grill stationery, the manager's hand tidy and hopeful, a farewell supper for the retiring chef, and a handful of regulars who remembered gumbo the way it was before menus got precious. "We'd be honored if you came," she wrote. "We'd like to give you your table back." The phrase "your table" sat on my tongue like a communion wafer that actually tasted like bread. I RSVP'd with a simple yes, the kind that doesn't explain itself. Before any reclaiming could happen, there was the small sport of depositions. Ronald's billboard lawyer, hair lacquered firm as a verdict, scheduled me for an afternoon on video. Linda sat to my left, legal pads in neat stacks. My hibiscus hummed the window behind us into color. He asked whether I'd liquidated assets in the heat of marital distress. I answered that I'd converted interests pursuant to my rights as sole member and owner, and that heat makes steel temper if you treat it correctly. He tried fragile nerves. Linda raised a single eyebrow, a metronome for foolishness. We produced bank affidavits describing me as exact and gracious, and the lawyer, disappointed in his narrative, shifted to the weather. When he signed off, Linda grinned. You just taught a master class in not letting someone name you. The night before the hearing, the porch circle met. Laverne with pound cake, Rhonda with her laugh like a snare drum, two new faces still learning how to unfold. We went around our little sun, setting small planets to rights. A budget renegotiated, a lump appointment booked, a prayer offered that didn't ask God to change anyone else, just to fortify the woman making the call. I served mint tea, sliced cake, passed my master gardener flashcards around so mild menaces like aphids and scale would have names my friends could cuss. When they left, the house held their warmth a beat longer, like a good pew after a long hymn. I wore navy for court, pearls for memory, flats for speed. Judge Albright took the bench with the unshowy gravity of a man who composes his face before traffic. Ronald sat 2 tables away, jaw clenched as if he were biting down on an alibi. His mother sat behind him in a hat that tried to make itself a witness. When the clerk called our case, the judge looked at the filings, then at me and Linda, then at Ronald and his lacquered counsel. Counsel, he said, I trust you've briefed your client on the difference between feeling wronged and actually being wrong. Billboard went first, flourish, sigh, words like strip mind, alienated affections, and fragile disposition hung in the air, expensive cologne without substance. Linda rose like a tide. Your Honor, my client is sole owner on record for the properties and the businesses at issue. What Mr. Miller calls strip mining is simply the exercise of rights he gave her when he parked assets in her name to avoid scrutiny that was, shall we say, inconvenient. She let the word breathe. We have affidavits, contracts, timestamps, and bank attestations. We also have credit card slips for a purchase that would not please the IRS, and will tender those if opposing counsel insists on moralizing. Judge Albright took off his glasses and pinched his nose the way a man does when a sinus twinge tries to become a headache. Mr. Miller, he said, do you dispute the signature on these deeds and membership certificates? Ronald tried charm. Your Honor, my wife has been under a great deal of stress. Answer the question, the judge said, voice like a door that shuts quietly because it is very, very solid. No, Ronald said, I don't dispute the signatures. Then the temporary orders are straightforward, the judge replied, setting his pen to paper. Exclusive possession of the marital residence to Mrs. Miller. Restraining order on transfers, maintain status quo on utilities and insurance, no harassment, mediation within 60 days. He glanced at me then, just for a heartbeat, something like respect sharpening the gray in his eyes. Mrs. Miller, I appreciate the clarity of your documentation. On the courthouse steps, Ronald's mother brushed my shoulder with a gloved hand, not quite on purpose. You've humiliated him, she said, the sentence and accusation dressed like concern. No, I answered. He did that. I just refused to wear it for him. I walked away before either of us could add anything unkind. The chef's farewell at Magnolia happened the next night. All the old smells lined up like a chorus, garlic, butter, shrimp shells tamed by fire. They seated me at my banquette. Staff I'd watched grow up in aprons stopped by to squeeze my palm, to tell me about their babies, their classes. The chef limped out from the kitchen to a standing ovation, face shining with heat and gratitude. He spotted me, barked a laugh. Girl, you still don't eat my okra, and I forgive you every time. I lifted my glass. I always loved your gumbo, I said. We both pretended not to notice when the front door opened and a familiar silhouette paused a heartbeat, then slipped away into Peachtree's river of lights. Some ghosts learn the new rules. Back home, the mail waited with its merciless mix of coupons and consequences. A large manila envelope stared up from the stack, the return address a shell company I recognized from Ronald's more ambitious days. Inside, a notice of Ellis Pendens filed against the lake cottage, a public record declaring a dispute over title designed to spook buyers and tangle clean lines, strategy masquerading as mess. My stomach didn't drop, it locked. I texted Linda a photo. She replied in under a minute. Improper on its face. Will quash. Be at my office 8 a.m. Bring cottage deed and any old communications. Then, you still have the blue accordion folder? I sent back a picture of it buckled into my passenger seat like a small, important child. I slept, but shallow, the way you do when the old house in your dreams complains in its joists. At 6:10, I was already showered, folder zipped, coffee in a travel mug, lipstick steady enough to sign an affidavit with. A text pinged. Patrice. Want me to come glare at someone? Me, not today. Save your glare for something that can't be fixed with paper. Another from Tessa, unexpected but clean. Made it to my aunt's in Savannah. I'm registering for classes. Thank you for telling me to leave faster next time. Me, proud of you. Keep going. At a red light, I glanced in the rear view. The woman there had slept. You could tell by the absence of shadow under the eyes, the way the mouth didn't curl as if braced for impact. I thought of the porch circle, the trumpet 2 blocks down, the rose that had opened its second bloom like it couldn't help it. I thought of Judge Albright's pen scratching a temporary future into shape. Linda's building rose out of morning glare, all tinted glass and quiet lobby. I took the elevator to 12. When the door slid open, her assistant was waiting with a smile and a legal pad. Miss Miller, come on back. Ms. Watson says we're going to turn a scare tactic into confetti. I followed, the folder under my arm a familiar weight. Behind Linda's door, the city lay spread in miniature, a grid I'd learned as a young wife driving kids to lessons, as an older woman finding her own classes. Linda stood, motioned me into the good chair, slid a draft motion across the desk. We'll ask for sanctions, she said. You don't get to cry wolf in a courthouse to punish a woman for reading her own name. Ready to swear this affidavit? I put my hand on the paper. The hibiscus print on my dress winked up like a co-conspirator. Ready, I said. And because life likes a symbol at the end of a measure, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I saw the subject line in the preview. Offer on the cottage. Cash. As is. Timing or providence or hustle meeting opportunity. I slid the phone face down for the moment. First the paper, then the rest. Linda clicked her pen. All right, Sharon, she said, the way a forewoman might call a crew to attention. Let's build. Outside, the day had the kind of blue that makes you think anything can decide to start. I signed my name where it needed to go, ink drying fast and dark. We'd quash the lien, we'd answer the next storm, we'd file for mediation with a list that didn't include compromise on dignity. And because a story deserves a small cliff to climb, the assistant poked her head in with one last envelope. Hand-delivered, heavy paper, the letterhead of a foundation I'd applied to on a whim after Laverne dared me. Ms. Miller, she said, eyes bright, they want to fund your Roses and Receipts clinic, full amount. They'd like you to pilot in 3 churches by summer. I held the letter, heard the future knock politely and then try the handle. Linda laughed. Look at that, she said. When you plant right, things root fast. I smiled back, heart stepping into a new room. Then I guess I better buy more chairs, I said. The Ellis pendants still sat on the desk like a dare. The offer on the cottage waited on my phone like a doorbell. Tomorrow's hearing about the lien would crowd my morning, but standing there with paper that promised rooms for women to learn the words that saved them, I felt the house of my life add a wing. Let's build, I repeated, and reached for the next pen. The morning we turned Ronald's scare tactic into confetti, Atlanta woke up with the kind of blue sky that makes you want to forgive traffic. Linda slid the signed order across her desk with a fingertip. List pendants quashed. Sanctions reserved pending his next performance, she said, voice bright as a snare drum. Clerk will record by close of business. I traced the embossed seal not because I doubted it, but because touch helps the truth sink past the skull into the bones. When a man tries to hang a dirty sheet on your clean line, there is a holy pleasure in watching the court take it down and fold it by the corners. On the elevator ride down, my phone vibed with the cash offer on the lake cottage. As is, the agent had said like a dare. I stood in the lobby where everything smells like citrus and decisions and pictured 27-year-old Sharon with sunburned shoulders and a fish we should have thrown back. I pictured 62-year-old me with a circle of women in lawn chairs, a whiteboard leaning against a pine, and a cooler full of lemonade labeled roses and receipts. I texted the agent. Counter. Not selling. Proposed seasonal rental with 2 weekend carve-outs each quarter. Non-negotiable. When he protested about market timing, I typed the sentence I just learned to live by. Timing belongs to me now. The foundation contract arrived 2 days later, all warm grant language wrapped around very cold bullet points. 3 congregations by summer, 10 clinics minimum. Outcomes measured, not just felt. I called Laverne first. You ready to be an usher in a different kind of service? She laughed like a tambourine. Baby, I was born passing plates. Pastor Green at Ebenezer said yes before I finished the pitch. You're building armor. The Lord approves. 2 more churches followed, a storefront sanctuary off Campbellton Road where the pastor wore Air Force Ones under his robe, and a white clapboard Baptist out in Lithonia with a fellowship hall that smelled like every casserole we ever owed each other. We built the syllabus at my kitchen island, which has seen more strategy than half. The boardrooms I sat in as a wife of a community leader. Module 1, know your name on paper. Titles, deeds, beneficiaries, how to spot a power of attorney that only goes one way. Module 2, emergency folder, copies, contacts, cash, keys, passwords. We handed out cobalt, blue accordions like something borrowed from my past but repurposed for futures. Module 3, receipts and rights, basic budgets, reading a bank statement like a love letter you no longer let lie. Module 4, locks and boundaries, literal, rekeying and cameras, and otherwise, scripts for phone calls when you stop letting people name you. There were snacks because women learn better when there's salt and sugar nearby. There were roses because symbolism is not a luxury. It's a tool. Word traveled the particular way it does in Atlanta, through salon chairs, choir lofts, and nail dryers. The first clinic filled before we opened the church doors. I stood at the front of the fellowship hall in navy slacks and a t-shirt that read "Mercy with Receipts" and tried to start without crying. 26 women stared back, plus 1 auntie who came for the cookies and stayed for the credit repair worksheet. Laverne took names. Patrice set up a document camera like she was about to cross-examine a mortgage. Lionel hovered at the coffee urn with that big-shouldered protectiveness men learn when they finally see their mothers as stories and not just scenery. We began with introductions that weren't demands. First names only, if that's what you have. What do you hope to plant? One woman said, peace. Another said, a down payment. Another whispered, my backbone. We passed out binders with tabs. I told my story in the edited version. No girl's hair color, no gossip, just the math. I was the name on the paper, I said. I'd been taught to hand that name over for convenience. Then I read it. Heads nodded like tall grass in a summer storm. Halfway through the second session, a deacon I knew by his cologne decided to audit us from the doorway. This feels adversarial, he said, arms folded, voice pitched with a little cluster of men who gather wherever authority seems bored. We believe in mending marriages here. I smiled, the one I save for men who mistake softness for surrender. So do we, I said. We're handing out needles and thread, but we're also teaching women not to darn a sock that's on fire. Laughter broke like pressure released. Even the deacon's mouth twitched. He left with a budget worksheet he pretended he didn't take. Between clinics, the Ronald weather system tried to spin up again. His lawyer filed a motion accusing me of weaponizing philanthropy for reputational gain. Linda filed a response so clean you could eat off it. Judge Albright set mediation and warned both sides that sanctions don't always wait politely at the end. Ronald texted a photo of the cottage dock at sunset, half apology, half bait. I stared long enough to feel my pulse lift, memory is muscle too, and then set the phone face down and returned to printing binders. Boundaries are not mean, they are accurate. The second church surprised me with how high hope lifts when you give it chairs. Miss Jean, 70 and bird-boned, arrived in a hat as wide as Mercy and asked if we could help her change a beneficiary. My nephew loves my cooking, she said. He don't need to love my checking account. Patrice walked her through the form. Miss Jean signed with a hand that remembered Sundays when pen and paper were a discipline and a dream. A young mother brought in a lease with midnight clauses. Linda, God bless her, came on her day off, circled 2 illegal lines in red, and coached her on how to deliver a sentence that ends a landlord's nonsense. Practice with me, Linda said, calling up her courtroom voice. The woman straightened mid-practice like a sapling remembering what the wind is for. Not everyone approved. Mother Miller cornered me outside the grocery store after session 3, grief on her face like a mascara mask. What you're doing is turning wives into judges, she said. You're teaching them to sit in the big chair. I looked at the shopping cart between us. My list paper clipped to the handle, apples blushing like they understood this had stopped being about produce. I'm teaching them to build the house they live in, I said. If there's a chair at the head of that table, it belongs to whoever paid for it and cleans it. She sighed a sound from deep in 1952 and left me to my Honeycrisp. Saturdays became a liturgy. Coffee urns, clipboards, laughter, the occasional quiet cry in a side room when a woman opened a bank app and finally said what she'd known for months. I moved among them like a forewoman, correcting grip on a pen here, encouraging posture there, handing out metaphor the way a good carpenter hands out shims. Plant deep, I'd say, tapping the rose canes in a vase by the sign-in sheet. Don't force the bloom, protect the roots, mulch with boundaries. By May, outcomes piled like letters I once thought I didn't deserve. 20 women opened emergency savings accounts. 12 added their names to titles they'd been told were too complicated to fix. 5 quietly retained attorneys using the referral list we kept in the cobalt accordions. 1, a high school counselor with a chuckle that makes a room light up, emailed a photo of her new keypad deadbolt with the caption, "Last 4 digits." My Anniversary with Me. I printed it and taped it inside the blue accordion that lives in my pantry. Some trophies should be hung where only the right eyes see them. We ran the first roses and receipts retreat at the cottage on a weekend when the lake forgot to be moody. 12 women, 1 grill, 5 coolers, a circle of lawn chairs that faced the water like the future was about to walk out of it. Patrice taught negotiating the no, which is what she calls declining the nonsense men or systems try to invoice you for. Lionel seared salmon and didn't ask questions. He didn't have the right to know. Drew fixed a loose step on the dock because some metaphors are too good to miss. We paired every hour of paperwork with an hour of planting. Rose slips nestled into new beds, fingers in soil learning how to demand depth. At dusk, we watched from the deck as solar lights winked on one by one along a path we'd laid without measuring tape, just the geometry of trust and timber. That night, after the last story, tucked itself under sleep and crickets tuned their tiny saws, I walked out to the end of the dock alone. My phone buzzed. Tessa again, but the tone was new. Got a job at a bakery. Morning shift. I like feeding the dawn. I texted back a photo of the lake swallowing the moon in ripples. Me too, I wrote. Keep going? Back in Atlanta the following week, a padded envelope arrived addressed in a tidy, unfamiliar hand. Inside, a thank you note from Miss Jean and a laminated recipe for 7-Up pound cake for your porch, she wrote. I propped the card by my stove and cried then, not the thin tears of humiliation, but the thick, clean kind that rinses the last grit of fear out of your ribs. I thought of how many rooms I'd sat in over 30 years, holding my breath so gently nothing moved, and I exhaled into my own kitchen like a woman who had finally built a door that fit its frame. That evening, as the sun slid behind the magnolia and the roses sighed into purple shade, Linda called. Mediation date confirmed, Judge Albright presiding, she said. He's an efficient man. Make a list of what you won't bargain away and we'll bring it like bread. I looked at my garden. Mulched, bounded, brave. Dignity, peace, the cottage carve-outs, and the clinics, I said. Everything else is negotiable, but those are load-bearing. Noted, she replied. See you Tuesday. I hung up, poured tea, and lit the citronella like a benediction. Somewhere down the block, the trumpet kid found a whole scale. The porch circle texted pictures of their new folders lined up like soldiers on a shelf. The magnolia held its blossoms like it finally learned the cost of smelling that sweet. I leaned back and let evening stitch itself to my skin. You can survive a lot, it turns out, if you learn to read your own name, plant your own roots, and write your own receipts. Mediation mornings don't feel like showdowns. They feel like surgeries. You wash your hands. You trust your team. You remember which organs are non-removable. I woke before dawn, walked the yard, and checked my list the way an engineer checks a beam. Dignity, peace, cottage carve-outs, clinics. Everything else could be measured, priced, or traded. Those 4 were load-bearing. I wore charcoal instead of navy, a small superstition that said today needed ink, not night, and clipped on the pearl studs that have watched me hold a line through births, graduations, and that one zoning hearing where a councilman tried to flirt his way past a setback requirement. Linda and I arrived early to a conference suite overlooking Midtown Glass. The mediator, Ms. Alvarez, had the steady brightness of someone who has seen couples try to turn a table back into a honeymoon suite and knows it's just furniture. 2 rooms, she said, palms open. I walk between. You don't have to sit in the blast radius of each other's tone of voice. I chose the chair facing the window. I like to talk terms with sky watching. Linda stacked her pads, capped her pen, and murmured, "Slow mouth, fast mind." I grinned. She knows my habits. They put Ronald and his lacquered attorney down the hall. I heard his laugh once through the glass and felt nothing register in the ribs. Ms. Alvarez opened with throat clearing, confidentiality, good faith, the way mediation lets people build their own rooms instead of letting a judge assign them a box. "Start with non-negotiables," she said. Linda slid forward our sheet like a meal ticket. Exclusive possession of the house through final decree. Cottage carve-outs exactly as already filed. No encumbrances on assets titled in my name. Mutual non-disparagement with narrow exceptions for court filings and therapist offices. And a clause protecting my clinics from any attempt to weaponize our divorce. No cease and desist letters for using my own last name, no interference with venue contracts. And we want the Ellis Pendon stunt acknowledged in writing as improper, Linda added, mild as tea. Miss Alvarez nodded like she already knew the shape of the day. She carried our list down the corridor. We sipped water. I inhaled, exhaled, pictured a plumb line dropping straight. When she returned, her expression said what her words confirmed. He wants the cottage, or cash to mourn it with. She unfolded a counter. He'd concede the house if I bought out his emotional equity in the Lake Place and restored a portion of the dealership stake, proceeds he considered ours. He also wanted a global gag clause. "It's framed as protecting reputation," she said, "but reads like a blanket you'd suffocate under." "No to the gag," I said. "I will not be a secret to my own work. As for the cottage, he can rent a lake by the weekend like everybody else. Or we find him a number that lets him remember without owning." Linda penciled. "We'll offer a fixed payment tied to his pension share, paid over 12 months, contingent on clean behavior. Any violation of the non-harassment order cancels the remainder." We added an inventory clause. He could list personal items to retrieve with a marshal present, photos, tools, the ugly fish plaque I never had the heart to throw out, but no second bite at furniture he'd ignored for years. "Put the dock in there," I said. "It stays. He can have the cracked cooler." The shuttle continued. Her to them, back to us, like a current finding the least rocky path. At one point, Ms. Alvarez leaned in. "He's stuck on the narrative that you stripped him," she said. "That's identity, not math. Can you live with a small face-saving sentence?" Linda didn't blink. "He can have one line in the recital that says the parties reorganized assets during a marital breakdown. No admissions, no apologies, no fiction." Around noon, Ms. Alvarez asked if we were willing to sit in the same room for 15 minutes to resolve the last 2 inches, the clinics clause and the cottage carve-outs. I said yes. Ronald entered with a jaw that looked like it was holding on to the past by its teeth. His lawyer took the far chair. Linda took the near one. Ms. Alvarez set a kitchen timer as if we were children, negotiating couch privileges. Ronald began with a sigh, as practiced as grace before Sunday dinner. "Sharon, the cottage, is mine," I said, not harsh, not soft. "You can ask for a feeling. You can't claim a deed." He tried again from the angle of nostalgia. "We taught the kids to swim there. We taught them to swim by letting go," I said. "That skill applies here." His mouth tightened, then flattened. "And these classes." He gestures hung a whole paragraph of contempt in the air. "You're turning churches into courtrooms." "Into tool rooms," I corrected. "If your mother's generation had had a blue folder, we might not be here." Ms. Alvarez reset the timer with a click like a gavel. Linda slid the clinic's clause across. "This protects her right to do work under her name without interference." she told his counsel. If your client is truly concerned with dignity, he'll appreciate not being mentioned at all. 2 beats. Ronald looked at the window, then at his lawyer, then briefly at me. I watched the arithmetic finish in his eyes. The judge we'd drawn, the sanctions hanging like a belt no one wanted to test, the public appetite for men who confuse charm with character. Fine, he said, and the word had the weight of a beam finally seated in its joist. But I want my father's toolbox. It's on the list, I said, labeled. Oiled the hinges for you. His face flickered. Memory is a plumb line, too. We signed term sheets at 3:17 p.m., the cheap ballpoint ink catching on thick paper in a way I found oddly comforting. Ms. Alvarez shook our hands and said something like, "May you never see me again," which might be the most sincere blessing a mediator can offer. In the hallway, Ronald hovered as if a different speech might still arrive. It didn't. "Tell Patrice I'm proud of her," he said instead, awkward as a man borrowing a suit. "Tell her yourself," I answered, and walked toward the elevator without inventing a softness that didn't belong to me anymore. That night, I took the Porch Circle's group text a photo of the term sheet with the essential lines blacked out and the words load-bearing held typed beneath. My phone pinged like a pinball machine. Praise hands, roses, cake emojis, the trumpet kid's mom sending a voice memo of him nailing a run. Laverne wrote, "Bring that clause Saturday. We're laminating it." I set the paper on the island beside Ms. Jean's pound cake recipe and cried just enough to clear my eyes for the dishes. The first clinic after mediation filled faster than a fishtail. We opened with shrugs and chairs for the latecomers, then I told the room what mattered, not the gossip, but the architecture. "Do not negotiate away what keeps your roof on," I said. "List it first. Say it steady. Trade for the paint, not the studs." Patrice taught a segment called How to Hear a Threat and Still Sleep, scripts for texts that arrive after midnight, what screenshots to keep, when to hand the phone to a lawyer and go water the roses. Linda stopped by in jeans and blessed the room with a 5-minute rundown on sanctions that had women grinning like they'd been handed tiny lightning bolts. We gave every attendee a strip of bright tape to stick inside her wallet that read, "Your name, your signature," a talisman, a reminder, a receipt. Afterward, a woman I didn't recognize lingered in the doorway, hat brim shadowing her face. When the room emptied, she stepped forward and took off the hat. Mother Miller. Her mouth worked around pride, then surrendered to practicality. "Do you have one of those blue folders for a friend?" she asked, eyes on a stain on the fellowship hall carpet that looked like Texas. I handed her a cobalt accordion, plain as a loaf. She slid it into her bag the way you hide a hymn you're not ready to sing out loud. "Thank you," she said barely. "For your clinics." "I'm building rooms," I said. "You can send folks who need a chair." She nodded once and left, shoulders 2 ounces lighter. I sat on the front step and laughed softly until it turned into a prayer. On Sunday, I drove to the cottage alone. The water wore its favorite moody blue. The dock creaked in welcome, and the hydrangeas argued with the bees about who loved summer more. I walked the property line, reciting the clause that protected it to the cicadas as if they were a jury that needed convincing. On the deck, I drafted a flyer for the next retreat. Roses and receipts, load-bearing edition, and scheduled dates that felt like gifts. My phone buzzed with a text from Tessa. "First week at the bakery done. I wake up before the sun and don't hate it. Bought a plant I can't kill." I sent back a photo of the lake and typed, "Me too." At dusk, back in Atlanta, I reheated gumbo I'd frozen from the chef's farewell and ate on the back steps while the roses exhaled pepper and promise. The house hummed with the new electricity that comes when rooms are used for the thing they were built for. The magnolia dropped one petal on the lawn like punctuation. I picked it up, tucked it in the blue folder for no reason I could name, and whispered to the evening, Phase 4. Because there's always a next build when you're still breathing. The settlement would be inked in weeks. The clinics would expand to a fourth church who'd called while I was driving. The trumpet kid would attempt a solo at the block party under our string lights. And I would sit at my own kitchen island and draft a syllabus for girls who shouldn't have to learn at 62 what we will teach them at 16. Your name is a foundation. Your signature is a beam. Your boundaries are the roof that keeps you dry. I washed the bowl, turned off the porch light, and let the new locks answer the door to the night with their sure, quiet click. Finality looks like paper until the pen touches it. The morning of the decree, I woke at the cottage to a lake so calm it felt ironed. Practiced my signature once on a grocery receipt, steady, centered. Then drove back to the city with the hibiscus printed on my dress, arguing happily with the dashboard sun. In court, Judge Albright read the settlement like a man reciting a recipe he trusts. Exclusive possession of the house until transfer is complete. Cottage carve-outs intact, mutual non-disparagement with enough air to let me do my clinics. Sanctions hanging in reserve if anybody got theatrical. He looked up. Anything else? Linda shook her head. I did too. The gavel's soft knock sounded like a door clicking shut from the inside. Ronald didn't meet my eyes. His tie was perfect. His mouth set to a line a tailor couldn't soften. When it was over, he nodded once. Acknowledgement, not forgiveness, and followed his lawyer out into the hall where men practice faces they can afford to keep. I stood for a breath, let the quiet move through me like cool water, then texted the porch circle, stamped, load-bearing held. The replies arrived like confetti, roses, scales, cake, a trumpet emoji that I knew belonged to the kid 2 blocks over who had learned to bend notes the way some people bend luck. The decree-freed hours I hadn't planned to have. I filled them the way an engineer does, with a blueprint. Roses and receipts rolled into a new season. 4 churches, 2 community centers, a Saturday pop-up at the farmer's market where we set up a folding table between peaches and pickles and taught women how to download bank statements like they were pulling biscuits from an oven. We added a teenager's track. 16 and signed? For girls who deserved to learn at 16 what we learned at 62. How to read your name, how to insist on joint titles, how to look a coach or a boyfriend in the eye and choose the version of love that doesn't require a disappearing act. Patrice taught that module like she'd been born with a chalkboard. She wrote "No" is a contract across the top and made them practice it until the word rang true and not just loud. Lionel film testimonials, the kind you don't post, the kind you save for grant officers who need proof that hope can be itemized. Drew, who claims he hates attention, became the man who showed up early to set chairs and left late after tightening wobble out of table legs. The night after court, Magnolia Grill hosted a neighborhood jazz supper for the chef's protégés, and I decided to reclaim a room I loved on purpose. The hostess, now a manager with shoes that didn't blister, squeezed my hand on the way to the corner banquette. "Your table," she said, no italics, no whisper. Staff who'd grown up in aprons stopped by to talk babies, classes, how to keep okra from getting slick. The chef shuffled out, towel over his shoulder like a benediction. "You still won't eat my okra," he laughed. "I'll repent if you keep the gumbo as holy as it's always been," I said. We both looked toward the door without meaning to. No ghosts. just Peachtree light widening and narrowing as cars slid past like schools of fish. When the bill came, I left a tip so familiar it felt like gratitude doing paperwork. Mother Miller appeared at my porch circle 2 Wednesdays later, hat smaller, voice lower. She didn't sit right away. Stood near the hydrangea as if apologies bloom faster in shade. When she did, she held a Bible with a satin ribbon and a folder I recognized because I'd chosen the shade. "For a friend," she said, meaning herself, and laid out questions about beneficiaries, medical directives, how to change the account where the usher checks landed. Patrice explained, soft around the edges. I poured sweet tea and didn't rescue her from the parts that stung. Regret has to do some burning to sterilize a wound. Before she left, she pressed a paper sack into my hands. Pound cake slices wrapped in wax paper still warm. "I made 2, she said, "old habits." I smiled like a truce. Some habits can stay. Tessa sent a photo at dawn, a tray of cinnamon rolls glazed like forgiveness, her hands dusted with flour up to the wrists, a caption. I passed the bakery at 4:45 and the sky says keep going. I drove to Savannah on a whim a week later, just because the road asked nicely, stood at her display case and bought a box I didn't need. We hugged lightly, the way 2 women do when they're careful not to crush the new bones they're growing. "You were kind when you didn't have to be," she said. "I was accurate," I answered. "Kindness is a side effect." On the drive home, I stopped at a nursery off the highway and bought 3 more roses because God loves a woman who ignores the backseat math of her own enthusiasm. The trumpet kid played his first solo at the block party under our string lights, sweat shining like lacquer on his temples. He bent a blue note so sweet the magnolia tried to bloom again out of season. The neighborhood shouted his name, Deshaun, and his mother cried into a napkin without apology. Between numbers, I handed out flyers for our next clinic and watched as a line of women formed by the folding table as if sugar drew them, not paper. A teen I didn't know asked if 16 and signed would teach how to read the fine print on a modeling contract. "Yes," I said, "and how to walk away if the print lies." She folded the flyer in 4s and tucked it into her phone case like a spell. The cottage became a classroom whenever the calendar offered up a weekend unmarred by weddings, storms, or people trying to rename other people's choices. We ran load-bearing edition again, 12 women, a whiteboard, a stack of cobalt folders, and a grill. Louis swore he'd clean this time, and did not. We walked the property line each morning holding coffee as if it were a compass, then sat in a circle and listed what we would not bargain away. On Saturday night, a cool wind came, the kind that makes a lake lift its shoulders. I told them how a judge's pen can feel like weather and a woman's list can feel like shelter. They slept in bunks and on couches and beneath a quilt that had survived 3 toddlers and an accidental wine stain shaped like the state of Georgia. In the morning, we planted 2 climbers near the dock, Peace and New Dawn, because you should name your hopes as often as you feed them. Ronald texted once after the decree with a photo of his father's toolbox open on a tailgate. "Looks good in daylight," he wrote. "Thank you for oiling the hinges." I typed and erased twice before settling on the only true thing I had left to offer him. "Take care of the tools that took care of you." He replied with a period and left me blessedly unpunctuated after. The foundation called to say our metrics made their board clap. 28 blue folders activated, 16 emergency funds started, 4 predatory leases renegotiated, one auntie opening a 529 for a grandbaby because she wanted him to meet a future she had the paperwork to authorize. They wanted us to expand to Macon and Columbus by fall. I looked at my calendar, at my porch, at the roses insisting on the long version of bloom and said yes with the caution joy deserves. "We can add a weekday evening," Laverne said. flipping pages on her church calendar like a conductor setting tempo. "We'll need a bigger urn," Rhonda added, already texting the deacon whose brother sells them out of a warehouse near the airport. "And a laminator," Patrice said, "because my child believes anything bound is twice as true." One afternoon, between banks and binders, I found a note tucked under my door. Thick paper, hand I didn't know. "Ms. Miller," it read, "I watched you carry yourself through a storm and then teach us how to check the weather. We have a city task force forming on financial literacy for women. Would you consider chairing?" I laughed out loud in my hallway, the sound bouncing off walls that finally refused to echo with anyone else's footsteps. I set the note beside Miss Jean's 7-Up pound cake recipe and the laminated "Your name, your signature" strip I keep like a talisman, and I let the offer sit long enough to see if it would pulse with obligation or purpose. Purpose 1. I emailed back, "Yes, if we can include protection from church-taught shame in our curriculum." The reply arrived in 6 minutes. "Please bring the lesson plan." That evening, I took a clean spiral notebook to the back steps and wrote the first line, "Mercy with Receipts, Municipal Edition." The roses exhaled that pepper tea scent that makes you mourn what you ever accepted instead. A breeze lifted the corner of the page like a hand asking permission to turn. The magnolia dropped a single petal onto the grass, white as truce, soft as an answer. Somewhere down the block, Deshawn practiced scales until the blue light came. When the porch circle arrived, we dragged out extra chairs without comment, passed slices of Mother Miller's cake around a circle that had room for the woman who'd once prayed me into patience and now prayed me into policy. We laminated the mediation clause because Laverne insisted some victories should be shiny. We tucked an extra cobalt folder into a grocery bag for a neighbor who had texted, "Can I come without saying why?" The answer, written 100 times by now across 100 sign-in sheets, was yes. The night pressed close and friendly. I locked the door behind my friends when they left and listened for the click that had become my favorite music. It sounded like a life seating itself where it belongs. Tomorrow would bring emails and agendas and a drive down to Lithonia with a trunk full of folders and a heart full of sentences. Tonight I rinsed the teacups, watered low and not over the leaves like Relly taught me, and stood under a sky that felt, for once, sized exactly right. At the edge of sleep, I thought of the girl in the restaurant window, the man with the perfect tie, the judge with the patient pen, the blue folders stacked like bridge trusses on my island, and the young trumpeter drawing breath for the next note. Freedom isn't loud, it's accurate, and accuracy, if you let it, will sing. City Hall smells like lemon polish and old intentions. On the morning the task force launched, I stood at the lectern under a mural of Atlanta's skyline and read my notes one last time. Bullet points, not paragraphs. Policy, not poetry. The mayor said the right words about equitable futures and financial dignity, then stepped aside. I kept it plain. 3 prongs, 6 months. First, literacy. Roses and receipts clinics in 10 neighborhoods with childcare and supper because information shouldn't require a babysitter you can't afford. Second, policy. A model, your name, your signature ordinance encouraging joint title on city-assisted home purchases and requiring plain language disclosures from any partner who touches public dollars. Third, protection. A hotline staffed by volunteer attorneys to untangle predatory leases and surprise liens before they devour a paycheck. I finished with a sentence that had become my spine. We are not teaching women to wage war. We are teaching them to build roofs that don't leak. Reporters wanted the divorce story tucked under those shingles. I gave them the only version that mattered. The court affirmed what the paper already knew: my name, my rights, the rest is private. One asked how it felt to come back to City Hall, not as someone's wife at a banquet table, but as a chair. I smiled, like a room finally sized for my voice. The work itself was less camera, more card table. Tuesday nights in Vine City, we set up in the rec center under a scoreboard that still blinked home and guest. We kept score our way. Blue folders handed out, beneficiaries corrected, emergency funds opened with $20 and a prayer. On Thursdays in Kirkwood, a line formed before I unlocked the church basement. At the front of each room, we mounted a poster with 4 words in big letters: load-bearing, do not trade. I watched women point at the words. When a cousin or a boyfriend tried to negotiate their list down to something easier to carry. Not for trade, they'd say, voice steadying. Patrice ran 16 and signed like a revival for girls who deserved better than a pop quiz from life. She brought in a modeling agent who respected minors, a banker who could explain APR without a smirk, and a therapist who taught them the difference between boundaries and brick walls. They learned how to read a lease and how to end a date without an apology. A shy sophomore raised her hand and asked if she could put her own savings in her own name. Yes, Patrice said, and the yes rang. The foundation sent auditors who wore comfortable shoes and serious expressions. They shadowed a clinic in a fellowship hall that smelled like coffee and pine sol, watched Ms. Jean help a neighbor change a beneficiary with a pen that no longer shook, and left with tears they blamed on allergy season. Metrics grew like a good vine. 42 folders activated, 23 beneficiaries corrected, 9 predatory clauses voided, 1 Judge Albright, sending a clerk on her lunch break with a bag of donated flash drives after he read our curriculum in the paper. Keep this off the record, his note said, but keep going. Ronald obeyed the settlement like a man who learned that sanctions aren't theoretical. Once, passing the farmer's market booth where we set up our pop-up, he tipped his hat without stopping and bought a jar of Laverne's pickles like a truce. Mother Miller began sending women to us on index cards, first a friend, then my neighbor, then my sister's girl, until the truth softened enough to sit down. She started staying through the break for the pound cake, then through the dismissal to ask Patrice about a clause she'd heard in Sunday school that didn't match Georgia law. On a rainy Wednesday, she pressed my hand and whispered, "You were right about the chair." And I answered by unfolding another one. Tessa's text messages bloomed like proof. First came photos of braided loaves, learning the hard doughs. Then the bakery's new sign with her name small but printed, assistant manager. Then a snapshot of a community college ID. Her face bright as a porch light. "I spent so long being scenery," she wrote. "Turns out I can build sets." I mailed her a cobalt folder and a sticker that said "Mercy with receipts" and drove down to Savannah one Saturday with roses that could handle heat. We planted them in chipped terracotta behind the bakery while a line formed for her cinnamon rolls. "I sleep good," she said, "before the sun even knows my name." "Me too," I answered, surprising myself with how true it felt. Deshawn, the trumpet kid, auditioned for the City Youth Jazz Band under lights that made his horn look like poured honey. The porch circle filled a row, Laverne in a hat with opinions, Rhonda with tissues she swore were for allergies. When he bent a note so clean the air trembled, I thought of how sound and policy share a secret. Both change rooms when they're tuned right. After, he hugged his mother hard, then told me he'd started a savings account for a valve job and a future. I slid a 20 into his hand the way my grandmother once slid a scripture into mine and told him to label it load-bearing. Summer leaned in, and the city's roses did what honest things do, opened without asking permission. We ran a clinic in Lithonia with folding chairs borrowed from a funeral home, the kind where grief and logistics often shake hands. A woman in a scrubs top asked how to stop a boyfriend from refinancing her car out from under her. We handed her a script and a lawyer's card. Another brought a contract from a singles cruise that was really a timeshare trap. Linda arrived on her day off, red pen like a lifeguard's whistle, and circled the exit clause. "You're free," she said, and the woman cried quiet tears that dried before they reached the edge of her mask. We added timeshares and other siren songs to the syllabus because curriculum, like gardens, demands pruning and grafting as the seasons teach you. The cottage weekends became pilgrimages. We kept the grill and the whiteboard and the ritual of walking the property line with coffee at dawn. We added a new rite, writing 3 sentences on index cards at the dock. What I won't trade, what I'm building, who gets a key. Women tucked the cards into cobalt folders, bra straps, Bibles, a few burned copies in a coffee can, and we watched the smoke carry their old stories off the water like a hymn learned and retired. One evening, as twilight made a quilt of the lake, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was the manager from Magnolia Grill. "Ms. Miller," she said, voice bright, "we're starting an employee financial wellness program. Direct deposit, emergency funds, basic paperwork. Chef says you won't touch okra, but you'll change a paycheck. Will you help?" I laughed so sudden I had to sit. "I'll trade recipes for templates," I said, "and I'll bring folders." That Sunday, I sat in my pew and watched a line of women, some I'd taught, some who taught me, move down the aisle toward communion. Pastor preached on the difference between a wilderness and a detour. I didn't glance at the pew where Ronald and his mother used to sit. I didn't count who nodded when the sermon hit a nerve. I let the choir climb and thought about municipal deadlines and a porch in Macon that needed chairs. Freedom isn't loud, it's accurate. That sentence kept matching the beat of my heart. On the first cool night of September, we threw a block supper under string lights and a forgiving sky. The table stretched longer than my old life. Everyone brought a dish their grandmother taught them to get right. Miss Jean's 7-Up pound cake stood at the end like punctuation. We made room for new neighbors and old grudges that had decided to retire. I gave a short toast because policy had bled into my manners. To roofs that don't leak, doors that fit their frames, and names that sign steady. Patrice clinked a glass with a ring and added, "To women who laminate their lists." Laughter rolled down the table like grace. After the dishes and the last fold-up chair, I walked my fence line and checked the latches. Habit by now, not fear. The magnolia dropped a single petal into the grass, white as a check mark. The roses breathed pepper and tea. Inside, the blue folders on my kitchen island looked less like armor and more like invitations. I slid one into a tote for the morning's clinic, tucked another in a bag for a woman Mother Miller's index card had only called tired, and left a third on the counter for a girl who would come to 16 and signed with questions about a first job and a first apartment, and the first time she'd have to choose between pleasing and protecting herself. Before bed, I stood at the mirror that had watched more than it should, and I saw a woman with shoulders level and a mouth no longer braced for impact. 30 years had taught me how to carry a house. 62 taught me how to build one. I turned off the light and listened for the click of the new lock. A sound so small it barely registers unless you've earned it. It came sure and quiet. Somewhere down the block, Deshaun practiced a run that didn't quite land and laughed at himself in a way that meant it would next time. I climbed into bed with a calendar that looked like a map and a heart that finally fit the room. Tomorrow there would be clipboards and childcare vouchers and a city committee that needed the stern kind of mercy. Tonight there was cool air through the window and the low hum of a home remembering my breathing. I whispered thank you to no one in particular and to everyone who had held a corner of the roof while I found the right nails. And because I am a woman who loves a list, I said my 4 load bearers out loud one more time before sleep found me. Dignity, peace, the cottage, the clinics. Then I added the new one I hadn't known to name a year ago. Joy that stands up straight.